Obviously some of you know me already, and it's great to see you. And for those that don't, my name's Warren Mansell. I've come down from the University of Manchester. The background of this talk is interesting. We did a study on spider phobia, which I'll explain to you. That got a lot of press interest, and Catherine Green, who was here, emailed me and said you should come down and tell us a bit about this study and the implications for it. So that's the context of it, and you know, it's just a perfect place to be coming and talking about this kind of topic. And as you can see, the theme of my talk is about control, and specifically I'm going to be talking on how and why should clients control their therapy from referral to recovery, i.e. through the whole process. Okay, and so I'm going to be talking about control and explaining why we should be thinking about control as a central concept when we're working with people. Does that sound like what you're expecting? Yeah, super.
Sounds good.
Okay. So I'm going to start with theory and the demonstrations of the theory that we use, and then I'm going to cover 4 different areas that we've been researching and applying our clinical methods. The first is in client-led appointment scheduling. The second is in client control during therapy, during the conversation in therapy. Third one is client control during exposure, and the fourth one is just looking at how control concepts might be integrated into existing CBT practice. Okay, so I'm going to try and cover those. I'm going to try and keep it quite clinically focused, but obviously I'm going to be describing theory and research as well. Has anybody got any questions? Okay, super. Okay, so I'm going to start by pointing to the fact that when you ask people with mental health difficulties, and I think particularly people with panic and anxiety and OCD and trauma, etc., themes of control come up consistently. It's found in the wider literature, but we've also done several of our own qualitative pieces of work where we've interviewed people using semi-structured interviews and just asked them about their experience of distress and recovery. And one of the strongest themes that comes out is this loss of control associated with their difficulties. They often talk about getting to a rock bottom with their problems, and that's when they start seeking help and start regaining control of their lives again. And I think people lose control of different things. In a panic attack, you literally lose control of your feelings and the behaviour. In a psychotic episode, you lose control of your mind and your normal mental faculties. In depression, you lose control of that ability just to get up and do things. And say in eating disorders, often you lose control of your own feeding because other people take that on for you because of the risks involved. So the type of thing you lose control over, I think, varies depending on the disorder, but consistently you see these themes of loss of control coming up. And I think if that's the case, then at least we should be looking to theories of control to understand how control works, if this is what clients are telling us is central to their difficulties. Does that make sense? Yeah. Now, when we think about control, control is absolutely vital to life. The most straightforward and well understood control process is homeostasis. This is the process through which we all stay alive. Our bodies are engaged in homeostasis both at the organ level and at the cellular level, keeping our body temperature the way we need it to be, keeping the salt ion concentrations, the hormone concentrations, the sugar particles, etc., all in a range that means that we can survive. And if our bodies weren't doing that, then we'd all be dead. Okay? And it's well accepted that homeostasis works through a process called negative feedback control. And the way that works is that there's elements in your brainstem that their function is to compare for example, the perceived temperature of your body to your survival temperature, say around 37 degrees, and to the extent that deviates, you engage in actions that then restore your temperature back to what it needs to be. So if you're too cold, you shiver. If you're too hot you sweat. Okay? That's your body engaging in a simple homeostatic process. But actually, there's a lot more control things happening at a behavioural level, most of which most of us aren't aware of most of the time. So the fact that all of you can sit up here and you can have a posture and you can keep your head upright and you can focus your eyes on me is all a control process, and you're doing that unconsciously now. There's actually pairs of muscles in your neck that are constantly kind of acting against each other to keep your head upright, so that if it flops one way, it kind of adjusts the other. And you're doing that without even thinking about it. If you weren't controlling right now, you'd all be slumped on the floor, and you wouldn't be able to know what to look at, and you wouldn't have control over that mental process. So I would argue that control at the behavioural level is just as important to survival, particularly in a social world, as the sort of homeostatic control process. So that leads us to think about, what does control using behaviour actually involve? So what I want you to do is look at this video. Some of you might have seen it before. It's two people, both with a pen in their hand, okay? And your instruction, or what you need to do, is try and work out what the person on the left has been instructed to do, okay? So, I'll just start that going. Okay. Can everyone see that? Lean around if you can't. It's only a half a minute. So you need to work out what that person on the left is doing, what they were told to do. Okay, so any guesses, if you haven't seen this before, as to what the person on the left was
Draw a cat.
doing? Draw a cat,
Rat,
okay.
surely.
Cat or a rat. Anyone thought that it was to draw a picture of something like a cat or a rat? So it's you two, put your hand up and thought that, okay. So a few of you thought it was to draw a picture of a cat or a rat or something, okay, super. Unfortunately that's not true, that's not what the instruction was, okay. Any other thoughts about what the instruction was?
So they're just copying the other person in terms of the distance of attention around.
Who thought that it was to copy the other person, to do the same or to do the opposite, mirror image or something like that? Yeah, quite a few of you. Yeah, unfortunately that's not true either. It wasn't to copy the other person. Okay.
I was trying to make the other person draw something by dragging.
Okay, no, it wasn't that. Any other thoughts about what it was, what the person on the left was doing? Anyone who hasn't seen this before?
I couldn't really see, but I thought maybe writing his or her name.
No. Okay.
Keeping your attention, maybe.
It's something about keeping something rather than drawing or do the opposite. It's about keeping something constant.
Distance the same.
Not quite.
Anything in the middle or something.
What in the middle? Are you sure you haven't seen this? So yes. So basically, there is a rubber band in the. There's a knot in the centre of this rubber band. The instruction that the left person on left had was to keep the knot over the dot. Okay? So you can see that when the person on the right does move, they have to do the opposite, which means that they will end up drawing something quite similar, or the mirror image. But actually, all they're doing and concentrating on is keeping the knot over the dot. Okay?
It's still a rat wearing a
Yeah, it's still a rat. Some people said two kangaroos boxing and said all kinds of things. But none of that is intentional. That's not the intentional kind of behaviour, as it were. So, let's go back to Keynote. Here we go, found it. Okay. So, what does that tell us? Any thoughts about what that tells us? You all saw the behaviour. You saw it in absolute detail. There's a record of the behaviour of the pen on the whiteboard. And yet, when I asked you what the person was doing, or at least what the person thought they were doing, nobody got it right. The behaviour from your perspective was not the same as what the person themselves thought they were doing. And so part of this tells us that that this idea that the observer's assessment of behaviour, which has got a long history in behavioural and cognitive psychology, there's something amiss about that if so many people can get it completely wrong by taking the observer perspective on behaviour. But it also illustrates the core of this theory, which is about what control is about. So the person on the left, the volunteer, was asked to keep the knot over the dot, okay? And that meant that they had to do what they needed to do with their behaviour to keep the knot over the dot. And when one person went one way, they had to go the opposite way, okay? So that was control. They had to keep the knot over the dot. They were comparing the distance or the location of the knot from the location of the dot, and to the degree that that was greater, they had to apply sort of a force in the opposite direction to get it back to where it needed to be again. And they had to keep on doing that continuously, continually comparing where they perceived it to where they wanted it to be. And you saw their movements were continually changing as well.
I thought it was going to be something like controlling one dimension leads to unexpected outcomes in another.
Right, well, it's simpler than that. So, what I'm illustrating to you there is how control works in behaviour, or at least according to perceptual control theory, which is that what we are controlling is our perceptual input, our sensory input. We're not directly controlling our behaviour. Our behaviour is what we use to control our experiences. It's like a psychological form of homeostasis, whereby instead of controlling physiological variables, you're controlling sensory variables. And the actions that you make are going out through the environment and back in again through your senses. And you're continually changing those actions, and tweaking and changing them to keep your perception of the world the way you want it to be. And that's the proposal of control theory. It's related to cybernetics, which some of you might know about, but it has got a very unique way of explaining control. And you can sum it up as behaviour as the control of perception, or you can sum it up as this kind of diagram, which looks very complicated, but the point of it is to show that while it may look like people are responding to a stimulus, actually what they're doing is they're continually changing their actions against something in the environment that we might call a stimulus, in order to keep a state of the world, their perceived world, the way they want it to be. And it's going in a continuous loop rather than being a sort of an on-off kind of experience. So the argument is that this is the way we're set up. We're set up to have these goal states, these desired perceptions of the world, and we're continually using our behaviour to make the world the way we want it to be. We don't always need to plan our behaviour to do that. We just need to do the action in the moment that works to get the perception of the world the way we want it to be. I'm showing you the whole of this because there is a very technical way that you can break this down into components, because perceptual control theory is a theory you can actually build stuff out of, build computer models, build robots to actually replicate the same processes that humans and other animals are engaged in. So it's not the kind of theory that just sort of sets out a proposition, sets of verbal statements. It's a theory that you build stuff from to show how valid the theory is. Okay, so that's the building block of it, but how on earth are we going to explain mental health problems out of this building block? Okay, the way to do it is to bring in some other principles of the theory. So we've started with control, the first principle, the argument that control is fundamental to life and that we control through comparing our perceptions of the world with the way we want them to be and continuously changing our actions to achieve that. The second principle is what we call hierarchies, which is about how do we manage complex activities given this. And what we do is we organise those little units, those loops, in hierarchies, whereby we achieve the long-term goals, the long-term states of the world that we want to live in, by setting sub-goals for example, the kind of routines that we want to do, or setting the kind of rules that we might have, which then set goals for the routines, which then set goals for the sequences of things, etc., etc. So the idea is that we manage complex things by organising it all in a hierarchy with the long-term stuff at the top that we want to control and the short-term momentary stuff at the bottom. And that most of the time we manage these really complex actions through having this hierarchical organisation of our goals. One of the things that is most pernicious and undermines our ability to control is conflict. And that is where someone's trying to control the same experience in opposing directions to the extent that it disrupts control. So think, for example, a person who tells themselves, I want to be a strong person, I want to show my family that I'm capable, I want to overcome my phobia of spiders. But at the same time, they're terrified that the spider's going to climb on them, going to bite them, that they're going to have a panic attack, etc. And so their control over their distance from the spider is extremely unstable. They don't have control over it because part of them wants to get closer and part of them wants to get further away. Think of another example of a client who's maybe had trauma when she was younger. She's managed to cope until now, but there's the opportunity, because of safeguarding, to take her perpetrator of her abuse to court. And now, instead of her goal being to try and forget everything that happened to her, now her goal is to try and remember everything that happened to her in absolute detail so that she's not seen as a false witness. And so now, this experience of how vividly she recalls her trauma, again, she's in complete conflict about. She doesn't know whether she wants to bury it to the back of her mind and tell herself it never happened, or explain it in so much detail that someone else knows that it really did happen. Okay, these clinical examples of conflict.
Is that the bit we used to call approach avoidance conflict?
Well, approach avoidance emerges from this. So, according to PCT, whether you approach or avoid something is the behaviour in the moment.
Yeah.
But what you've actually got, as we'll show in the spider study, is a perceptual reference point of either a spider being very far away or a spider being very close. And if you've got a reference point for it being close, you're going to approach it most of the time. And if you've got it being far away, you're going to avoid it most of the time. But you're not going to need to avoid it if it's not in the room. So these systems are active all the time, and they're not necessarily going to engage behaviour until your environment goes out of the way you want it to be, if that makes sense. The final principle is reorganisation, which you kind of need in this to explain how these systems get set up in the first place, and how, when there is this conflict, you can work through it in a way that means that that person can eventually, report the memories they want to report or face the fears they want to face. And the interesting thing is reorganisation has to be inbuilt into the system. So it has to be very simplistic, trial and error system. You could liken it to trial and error learning in operant conditioning, except behaviours aren't being learnt. What's being learnt are the components of these control systems. And the longer that those systems are allowed to reorganise, the greater chance they've got of stumbling upon an effective organisation that's actually going to work and to regain control. And for us, that explains why we need sustained awareness on an experience in order to overcome it. Because the longer you're aware of something, the more chance you've got for these trial and error learning processes to actually change your goals and allow you to regain control again. So, once you get all these principles together, what does this tell us about the active ingredient of therapy? It would be an environment that allows the client to shift and sustain awareness to the systems driving the goal conflict that's undermining control. So the idea is that most of the time, most of us are solving everyday conflicts when we're deciding where to live, where to work, what to eat tonight. We're solving those all the time. And that's because our awareness goes to them, we talk about them, we think about them, whereas the problems that are disabling our clients are ones that they're either unwilling or unable to talk or think about long enough and to sustain their awareness on all the thoughts and feelings around them in order to solve them for themselves. And so the idea is that most of our clients, what's at the root of their difficulties is not in their awareness for any length of time, and our job is to help them get their awareness there and keep it there long enough to make a difference. Okay, so let's go right now to the kind of the practical implications of this, makes sense. So let's think of the practical implications of the first part of this, which is the idea that control is fundamental to living things, fundamental to well-being, and fundamental to living health, to mental health. If that's the case, why shouldn't we be giving control, or as much control as works, as it isn't risky or dangerous, to our clients? And the most obvious place to start to give them control is just how they book the appointments to come and see you, how many appointments they choose to have, and how long those appointments take. Okay? Now, we're in a shocking situation at the moment where nearly half of all appointments, for example in IAPT, are non-attendance appointments, which is a massive wastage, most likely far more than £100 million a year in this country alone, because people are being sent appointments and they're not attending them. Okay? Now, Tim Carey and colleagues shifted to a client scheduling system in Fife a number of years ago and monitored a number of variables before and after their shift in appointment scheduling. The first thing they found is that the number of DNAs, non-attendances, dropped massively because people were booking their own appointments. They were only booking it when they knew they could turn up, where most people had zero non-attendances. They found that actually there were huge individual differences in terms of the numbers of sessions that people chose to have, which obviously contrasts with the idea that we think there's a fixed number of sessions that's appropriate. The actual average that people chose was a very small and manageable number, between 3 and 5. There was a massive reduction in waiting lists through this intervention, and the therapy itself, if you looked at symptom change per session, became far more efficient than benchmark studies in services where appointments have been sent out to people. Okay?
So, was that, sorry, go
Yeah,
on.
yeah. So basically, you allow patients to choose their appointments and decide how much therapy they need.
Right from the start.
Right from the start. And that's
So,
what.
contact us to book if you'd like to book an appointment.
Yeah,
And then
or
you meet
they
your
might even need to
therapist.
contact you. You could have an online
Okay.
booking sheet, and they just sign into it.
Okay, and then they meet the therapist, and what does the therapist say? Oh, we recommend 12 sessions, or do they just
Well, if
say,
they're doing method levels, they wouldn't say that.
okay,
They just say, here's a session, tell me when you think you've had enough for today, and then book another one when you're ready for
so
another
we're
one.
halfway through the formulation, but you want to stop there?
We
so
don't do
we'll stop
formulation
there.
either.
Okay, what
So
are you
this is-
doing in these sessions?
Method of levels therapy, which I'll come back
need
to.
3 sessions.
Because you get straight to the heart of it. Okay?
So this
So-
isn't, we're not looking at, this wasn't done in an IACT service, for
No,
example.
no, but all these ones below have been done in different services. So we did a presentation at the BABCP conference this year, where a whole selection of us who'd applied client-led booking in different contexts reported it. So Tim also has got data he's got data from secondary care and primary care. Rob Griffiths, who's got an NIHR fellowship studying this, has been doing it in early intervention in psychosis, and he also did it in his clinical practice. Saratai has done it in inpatient wards, where basically whoever comes in, you just say, hello, I'm a psychologist here, just write your name up whenever you want to come. Anytime I'm here, you can see me, as long as no one else is seeing me at the same time. Child and adolescent mental health services, my wife instigated that for a trial period. Then in schools we're implementing it, and Viv Huddy at UCL implemented it in prisons. And now, these studies vary in terms of some of them are service audits, others are research studies like Rob's, but you generally find exactly the same pattern. And consistently you find this reduction in DNAs from the sort of pre-intervention rates about 30-40% down to about 7% after you allow people to book their own appointments.
Is there any data on whether that's compatible with a sort of CBT approach, or is that?
It's interesting. There's a different. Are any of these CBT? No, none of these are CBT. Louise's was a reflective assessment consultation appointment, rather than method levels, but all the others are method levels.
Yeah, I just wondering whether sort of the fundamental sort of inherent structure in a CBT approach would sort of cut into that approach.
Which is a shame, isn't it, really, given that it's so many advantages of having this client-led scheduling. Okay, so that's my kind of just summary there. That's one slide on that, and to be honest, I'd be really upset if you don't remember that slide, because it's so simple and it's so intuitive. Rob Griffiths wrote an article on this in CBT Today the other day, and he said, when you set up a new cinema, you don't send out appointments to people and say, you're going to go and see the film on a Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock. You know, you just provide people the opportunity to book them in.
Yeah, but you're only bowling up to see one film. You're not bowling up to see a film that's delivered in 12 sections.
Yeah, but we don't require people to have 12 sessions.
No,
so.
or 5, or whatever. No, it's
People
just,
can go
it's
to as
really
many as they like.
interesting, but it's hard to think about how does this.
Okay,
How can we apply
okay.
this?
This is
Right.
the Netflix of therapy.
Yeah, I don't mind that.
Streaming on demand.
I've also got an analogy whereby it's the straight ethanol of therapy, but we'll get back to that, rather than mixing your drinks, as often happens in therapists.
Practically, how do people book in?
So practically, they either phone up a receptionist who books them into a single timetable, or they use an online approach.
Where do those IAPT numbers come from?
Yeah, that's national data,
But in terms of like the first appointments or all appointments?
across all appointments.
Step 2 and step 3.
What? Yeah, that's.
That is massive.
It's across all IAPT, I think, as far as I understand.
In terms of what? So I was saying, it just doesn't match my experience in IAPT, so I'm just curious.
Got it from a paper that just reported it as, you know, from a certain evaluation period of IAPT data.
Yeah.
Yeah, I said you the paper. Yeah. Okay, right. Let's hone in on something simple. Okay, the actual process of exposure that maybe everyone thinks they've got kind of nailed. This is our study. It's not a submission now. Should change that. We wanted to test whether exposure works purely by virtue of the fact you're being exposed to something you're afraid of, or whether your control over that degree of exposure is important, how important that is. So the way we did it is recruited a large number of spider-fearful participants. We first asked them about their goals for facing their fear and their reasons for not facing their fears, to sort of appreciate the fact that people have high-level goals and they're in conflict over them. So we allow people to kind of raise awareness of why they might want to face this fear and why they might not. At no point did we tell them this was an exposure therapy or that they should be looking at the spider or getting any closer. The decision was completely down to them, and we actually asked them equally about reasons for facing it and reasons for not facing it. Then they took part in the computerised exposure task, where they tried to control a spider image that moved towards or away from them on its own accord, but their movements then were superimposed on that to try and keep it where they wanted it to be. And then we compared half of them that had high control over that distance from the spider, and the other half were yoked to the same participant. So every individual was yoked such that the low control participant got the exposures that the high control participant had created for themselves, whereas the low control participant had almost no control over that. Okay? So you've got exact matching of exposure across pairs of participants across the whole study. And what you find is that this was the degree of approach towards a spider in a jar before and after the intervention. The people that there's an interaction such that the participants that had control approached closer, and the ones that didn't approached further. So even though it's the same amount of exposure, having control over it seemed to actually mean that they wanted to then go and approach it more by themselves in future. But when they didn't have control over it, they actually tended in the opposite direction. And you actually see this as well 2 weeks later. The people that weren't in control of their exposure tended towards more avoidance of spiders in everyday life, whereas the high control stayed about the same. And I think, again, I think this is really important. And there have been studies looking at control in phobias, but most of them are confounded by all kinds of factors. Whereas because we yoked the participants, we knew that the exposure was equal in both groups. So there's something intrinsic about control during this momentary process of exposure in a psychological intervention. Okay? Now, what would I say the impact of this? And we've done some of this work. Interestingly, Alec Brady and David Rains had already written it up a few years ago. And it's a way of doing graded hierarchies that is more flexible and more client-driven. So, first, again, you're going to ask the person about their motivations, about why they want to face it, why they want to avoid it. It gives them control, it gives them full kind of informed consent, if you like, as to whether they're going to go towards or away from this image. Then you ask the client to tell you the range of anxiety that they would be willing to experience whilst they face their fear. And then you start with an experience, you find something, some stimulus in your environment, some object, some creature, some video clip, whatever, that gets them into that anxious range, okay? And then you start to titrate that to the individual. So essentially, what you're asking them to do is they're staying with that level of anxiety. Whilst they're staying with it, what we tend to do is just, rather than kind of say, giving them instructions to stay with it, we tend to ask them questions about the perceptual qualities of what they notice. So if they're looking at a spider, it's like, how many legs has it got? All its legs, and how is it moving? Do you notice it moving? And so questions that get them to process that experience, and very regularly ask them to tell you how anxious they are. As soon as the anxiety drops to a lower level that's outside this sort of exposure range, you then say, oh, can we do something else with this now to prompt your anxiety a bit? We've got one method where we just give people a book where they can just open it themselves. And you just keep on going, keep on upping the experience in the environment to keep the arousal level, the anxiety level, fairly constant in this, but manageable at the same time. And you do this dynamically on the spur of the moment with the client, rather than in a way where you're sort of sitting down and planning it and setting kind of grades on your hierarchy in a laborious manner. You've got all the experiences there with you. So if it's a spider phobia, you've got a real spider, you've got pictures, you've got video clips, etc. And you just bring them in as and when the client is ready for them. And when the client says, I think I've done enough for today, then you stop. So this is how one would do exposure from a control theory point of view. Because all you're interested in is the client's perceptual experiences rather than their actual behaviour or what it says on the sheet that they're doing. And you're just going to change the things in the environment to keep it the way that they know they can manage. And as soon as it dips, you're giving them the opportunity to face something more. So our next plan is to do this kind of process within patients and see how efficient it is compared to normal exposure or behavioural experiments.
With the curious perceptual questions, are they all questions about what the person can literally perceive?
They may be about imagery. If they get imagery in their head while they're doing it, you'll tend to prioritise the imagery, because that will be more perceptually salient. Yeah.
And bodily sensations?
Same thing, it's all part of it.
So it's whatever they're most aware of.
Yeah.
In that
And they will tell you
yeah.
what they're aware of at that moment, and you just track that and work with that. And you know that if they're already getting images of the wasp flying around their head or whatever, and they're feeling 5 out of 10 anxious, you don't need to do much else. You're just going to go with that until it gets to a state where they're ready for something different. Yeah. Okay, so that's exposure going to a control theory approach. What about just the everyday process of conversation and Socratic questioning in therapy? Now, this is a Metalevel's study, but I think the principle is something that we could really apply in terms of research and think about in terms of how we talk to clients. So what we did is people had a Metalevel session. The client then viewed the video of their therapy session, and we stop the video every 2 minutes and ask them to give us some ratings of how that last 2 minutes of the session worked. And what we were interested in is what properties of that conversation were correlated with helpfulness as perceived by the client. Okay? And obviously we had some hypotheses around what might be particularly helpful when you're having a conversation. And we use multi-level analysis to look and see which of those factors in a regression was more closely related to helpfulness on a moment-by-moment, minute-by-minute basis. And this is our results of our regression. This came out in behavioural cognitive psychotherapy recently.
Could you say a bit more about what method of levels is?
That's coming up then.
Okay.
I thought I'd save that for you.
So it's still a blank.
Well, it won't be soon.
Method of levels.
So what you find is that control, how much they feel in control of the session, is highly correlated with how helpful it is. How able they feel to talk freely is very correlated with how helpful it is, and the therapist approach, whether this approach works for me. Interestingly, facets like therapeutic relationship drop out when you've got things like control and talk freely in this regression. But at zero order, all of these correlate with helpfulness. In the regression, those three kind of take up the variance.
If you didn't feel able to talk freely or to have much control, you might not consider you had a very good therapeutic relationship anyway. Do you know what I mean? I mean,
You'd
the
think so, wouldn't you?
relationship might be defined by those features.
But maybe the
or
control is the most important part of the relationship, and that's why it's swamping out the variance. Okay, and that leads us into meta-level therapy, because meta-level therapy is about how do you talk to someone about their problems in a way that gives the client as much control as possible? Or, put it another way, how do you do therapy without getting in the way of the clients and helping them to do most of the work, if you like, in the session? So we would describe it as a transdiagnostic cognitive therapy. In this, that's not quite true. Every therapist statement is a question or a comment largely. Okay. The most important thing is that there are two goals in meta-level therapy. The first one is to help the client talk about the problem in the present moment and exploring any perceptions as they arise. The second goal is to ask them about what we call disruptions. Disruptions are where the speech of a person is disrupted by something. It could be a change of topic, it could be emphasising a certain word, it could be shifting their eyes, it could be a change in affect, it could be a pause, it could be speeding up in their talk. Something that just goes on a non-verbal level that you notice is happening while the person's talking. And what you do is you don't interpret that in any way, you just put it back to the person that you notice something, because your hunch is that there's some kind of background thought, something at the outside their awareness that they haven't quite put into words yet, that you can help them to bring into their foregrounds by asking about it. And all you do is iteratively follow these two goals and do whatever you need to do to pursue these two goals. Now obviously, if you want the client to do most of the talking about the problem, your questions are going to have to be fairly short, fairly to the point, and the whole point of this is to keep things in the present moment. So we would say that this style of therapy helps the client to be in control, to talk freely, and to shift and sustain their awareness according to theory on the systems governing the goal conflict. The idea is that when you're catching disruptions, you're catching sometimes with a smile or a wince, those subtleties of, oh, I'm saying this, but it sounds ridiculous. What makes it sound ridiculous? You're catching some of those conflicts or those meta-level thoughts as the person's talking, and then you're going into those rather than being stuck necessarily on the topic that you started with.
So the spotlight isn't labelling what you've observed.
Yeah, you may or may not label it, but you might say, "Oh, what happened just then? Was there something else you wanted to tell me?"
Yeah.
Or when you smiled, what was going through your mind? Or are you noticing something because you just kind of paused then? What was that about? So it's that kind of question. So that's the therapy. This is a small pilot RCT that we did of Metalevel Therapy, which has got lots of caveats to it. It was only over a 3-month period, but it was an intention to treat analysis, and we found that there were significant drops in anxiety and depression in method levels compared to a treatment as usual, which was interesting because the treatment as usual, people were either on a waiting list or they were sort of halfway through their CBT. So you might argue you're not comparing apples with apples, but over that 3-month window, the method levels led to these significant drops. These are papers that are published where method levels has been used in very pragmatic settings as a transdiagnostic intervention. So in these examples, people haven't been selected out on any factors other than appropriateness for a different service, and then method levels have been provided, and generally you get these effect sizes in the large range in these different settings. 3 of them were primary care and 1 of them was secondary care. Okay, so that's method levels, and I guess finally, if all of this sounds a bit too much in terms of client-led appointment scheduling, redoing the way you do exposure, and learning new therapy, there are ways that you can consider the importance of client control in regular CBT. And I'm sure some of you do loads of this already.
Yeah, I don't think the exposure is really interesting to see some of that research, but I think a lot of that's sort of good exposure anyway, you know, not forcing someone to do it, but having it quite.
But isn't it funny how it's never been studied? It's just
I mean, that is, well, yeah, that is interesting.
It has been studied, but there have been confounds in how they've tried to test it. And so there's been this open question as to whether the therapist should lead it or simply allow these experiences for the client to make their own decisions about. And this evidence is leaning it towards the fact that the client should be in control, essentially. So, for example, help the client take the lead in the gender setting. Probably all do that already, but if you don't, that sounds like a pretty sensible idea. Exploring the pros and cons of safety-seeking behaviour. So, trying to let go of any assumptions we have that safety-seeking behaviours are either a good or a bad thing. Because, as you all know, safety-seeking behaviours are things that people do for a reason that are also potentially counterproductive. But that surely should be something that could be that the client should find self-evident once they can explore both the advantages and the disadvantages of any particular safety behaviour. And arguably, if you give them enough opportunity to consider what they get out of them and what their drawbacks are, they can help to make a decision as to which ones they're going to drop when, rather than you having to think of, you know, your own sort of clinical reasons why it should be this one, and then kind of have difficulties with engagement, for example. Just when people talk about control, ask about it. Ask about what kind of things the person wants to control in their lives. How do they balance things they control in their lives? When goal conflicts come up, just discuss them. Talk about them. Talk about both sides. Talk about them equally, rather than feeling that you have to kind of be on one side of this. And when you are doing experiences where you're asking clients about their imagery, about their moods, when you're doing behavioural experiments or exposure, anything that just keeps their awareness with whatever they're on, whether it be a metaphor or some imagery, long enough so that they start to notice some spontaneous changes in what they're experiencing. Because we would propose that that is when the reorganisation is actually having some effect. But the person's awareness needs to be there long enough for those changes to happen. And I think hopefully you've introduced a few kind of subtleties about how you can engage people with questions during that process, rather than thinking it's like this torturous process of just sitting there and being exposed to something unpleasant. So that really is the sort of the 4 areas. Summary, I think, is that having this kind of approach based on client control greatly simplifies the way that therapy is provided. And as you've kind of noticed as you've been listening to this, it does shift a lot of the assumptions we have about not just CBT, but how any psychological therapy is delivered and the role of the therapist in making certain decisions about that delivery process. And hopefully I've covered with you some emerging evidence that control is fundamental, that when clients have control over the delivery of therapy, it improves its efficiency, that when clients have control over the process of therapy, it might improve its effects, and that to some degree, the idea that there needs to be some long-term established therapeutic relationship, or even that the therapist needs to have as good as understanding of the client's problem as they do, might be called into question. From Metalevel's perspective, when you're asking people's questions, there's no requirement for you as a Metalevel's therapist to understand a person's problems. You're remaining curious and helping them to understand and explore without requiring some shared agreed formulation. And for us, that makes the whole therapy so much more flexible because you can provide it in contexts where your opportunities to see people for a consistent set number of sessions with a specific formulation are really minimal. So inpatient settings, prisons, drop-in centres. And so it just improves the flexibility of what you're able to do with clients and makes you just present there when you're working with them. So we would argue that Metalevel therapy therefore is particularly efficient. It's a distinctive kind of therapy, as you probably could tell, and it adapts to those kind of challenging contexts. And we're just carrying on this kind of research into the future. These are the kind of probably the most straightforward sources of this information in terms of if you wanted to do further reading. The first one's a therapy manual, the second one's a review article, and then we've got websites, my Twitter, and my YouTube channel. So, hopefully we've got a bit of time for further discussion and these kind of questions.
I'm sure there's a very obvious answer to this, but how does Metalevel therapy differ from counselling, for example?
Yeah, well, we've done a bit of research where we've submitted MOL to about 6 different therapies and counselling frameworks, including person-centred counselling. And Metalevel comes up as having more open questions, more closed questions and more open questions, and more statements about non-verbal experiences than any of the other therapies that it was compared to. There's no information giving, no interpretations made, very little confrontation, whereas those aspects come into other therapies. So it appears to be really distinctive from all the therapies that we've compared it to so far.
So are there people that wouldn't work for?
Do you have a hunch?
No. Yeah, just CD.
I was just wondering.
I mean, there's certainly people that aren't ready for therapy in general, and I don't think Metalevel is necessarily magic, and it's going to be suitable for everyone who doesn't want to talk, doesn't want to go to therapy. You need to be willing to talk about a problem, and you need to answer questions while you're talking about a problem. And to be honest, there are some people that go through other therapies, do all the kind of the talk, but actually they're not really sustaining their attention on a problem for that period, and they wouldn't get away with that in Metalevel because you continually bring it back to them and say, what's the problem about that right now? So it stops, it allows people to kind of really focus on that, and that may put some people off if they're not ready.
Going into sort of stream of consciousness, like past experience.
If they want to talk about past experiences, they can, but we'll always be asking, and so how's that? How are you dealing with that at the moment? How are you managing that now?
So if I'm rolling in with OCD, for example,
if
I'm coming in as a patient with OCD, then I could imagine that getting into a very, very detailed description of.
Okay, I've got an OCD example here. Okay, the client comes in and says, "I must check appliances all the time." Okay.
It's like I've set you up.
Yeah, I know. You didn't want to do that, did you?
Never met each other before.
Yeah. And you say, what makes you grimace when you say that? You just notice that the person grimaced when they said, I check appliances all the time. And the client actually responds by saying, oh, well, I criticise myself all the time for doing it, even though I do it. Okay? So already you're noticing this conflict. They do something, they check in all the time, but also they're criticising themselves for doing the same thing that they really want to do. Oh, so you check and you criticise yourself for checking. How does that work? So you're curious about that conflict, that paradox of how they're doing something and yet not wanting to do it at the same time. And through the conversation, you actually go up a level and find the goals that are behind the two of those. So the reason why they check appliances all the time is that they think, I must not be responsible for bad things happening. And the reason that they criticise themselves for checking is that they want to be a normal and reasonable person. Fair enough, that's how it unfolds. How does it sound to say that you want to be responsible, normal and reasonable? I just want to be a good person. So you go up to this higher perspective where they realise that they've got two principles here that are at loggerheads with each other in their OCD. They need to be responsible and they need to just be normal. And in the here and now, that's impacting on them doing all kinds of things to be the most perfect responsible person and all kinds of things to stop themselves from being, you know, stupid and unreasonable and yeah, whatever. So yeah, so yes, if someone comes, so for example, if someone comes with ACD, you could end up having that conversation.
Aren't there people like with OCD and maybe other disorders as well who are actually over-controlling their world though?
They're all associated with, nearly all associated with over-control.
It seems like your approach is sort of focused on enabling the person to connect with their environments and to control their environment, but I just wonder, and there's clearly a lot of people I can imagine that would be really helpful for the therapist to pass over that control, but I can imagine there's some populations where really part of the problem is that they're massively over-controlling.
Well, let's just say that we have an assumption that human beings are pretty complex. They actually need to control a lot of different kinds of things in their lives. They, including, you know, their aspects of their relationships, including their work, including their daily routine, etc., etc. And what you're drawing attention to there is the fact that many people who come to us have overvalued one domain of their life and put a lot of control into that. And the fact they put so much control into that aspect has meant they've lost control of other aspects of their lives. They've ended up in arguments, they've ended up losing their job, etc., etc., because they put so much energy into that. Metalevels is about opening up that perspective and talking to people and saying, okay, so you're controlling that, and how's that going for you? What other things do you want in life, and how's that affecting this, and why is this a problem? And all those questions help people tell you all the different things they're trying to control and balance. And that's the aim of the therapy, is to get someone in control of their lives as a whole, rather than to sort of be controlling something that they kind of know is not working. But you're hitting on something there, and this is possibly why we often at loggerheads with people who practice ACT therapy, which is that the assumption in ACT is that control is a bad thing, and our assumption is that control is a good thing. So that's at loggerheads. But the problem is that we think that from an ACT perspective has a very kind of tends to have the everyday definition of the term control, rather than the technical definition of control. Because people normally are only aware of controlling something when it's consciously brought to their attention and they're struggling to do it. But actually, like I told you before, in terms of your posture and your daily activities and your chats and your language, most of the stuff that we're controlling is automated and we're not aware of it. And some people with mental health problems lose control over those kind of aspects. And they need to gain control over again, the ability to talk fluently, the ability to have lasting relationships. Things that for most of us, we almost take them for granted because they happen so naturally. And it's not surprising that if someone suddenly loses control over things that we take for granted and don't notice, that they're going to be obsessed by trying to regain that control again. And in doing so, try and put huge amounts of effort into one domain. And so our approach is to help the person validate the fact they need control, but to help them control the things that are really going to be lasting and really help them kind of regain well-being, if you like. Is that answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting, and the idea of rebalancing control is really interesting. I'm just struggling to work out how, I think if someone with a GAD problem or something, staying up all night over preparing for something, can't tolerate uncertainty of the eventualities and tomorrow or something, and think, how can you encourage them to sort of relinquish that kind of control? Because it sounds like you're not really giving directive. So,
just as I say, having the same kind of conversations as I showed in that example, just get them to talk about it, how they do it, when they do it, what happens when they do it, why it's a problem, what makes it a problem, how they'd like it to be, and continuing any thoughts and feelings and images they get as they're telling you about it. What happened just there is I realise I'm just being the same as my dad used to be, or so just catching stuff that gives them a bit more depth to the reasons why as they're talking, and sitting with that. What we think we're doing is exactly what everyone's brain does naturally most of the time, which is your attention is drawn to stuff in your life where things aren't working, where you're making mistakes. You kind of focus on it, you think about it, you talk to people about it, and then you sort it out. The brain naturally does that, and Metalevel Therapy, we think, is a way of a therapist helping the brain to do what it does naturally by going to the places that it would go to if the person hadn't constantly been kind of redirecting it or kind of engaging in some of these other control activities that take their awareness away from where it really needs to go to manage things better in their lives.
Helping them to work out what really needs to be fixed.
Yeah. And we would say that will always involve going up levels in terms of one's goals and ideals and principles and rules, as it were.
And would you talk about those levels?
Explicitly, no. No. If they want to know, we can tell them, but we're just helping them, we're just tracking their awareness and sort of scaffolding their awareness as they're talking. So that we're, sometimes when people have done Metalevel Therapy, they kind of can't quite remember what the questions were because they were so much in their own head processing stuff. And most clients I talk to afterwards and they say, what's this like compared to other therapies? They say, well, in other therapies, the therapist does more of the talking than in Metalevels. And I've never really thought about it in this way before. So you're allowing the client to take it to a depth that when you come in often with your own pre-prepared structure, you kind of miss what we would suggest.
So there's no goals.
There's no therapist goals except, two therapist goals: to help the client talk about the problem, whatever they deem as a problem, and to notice disruptions. So you don't have any goals for the patient besides that. Yeah.
But do you come up with, when you ask about goal setting as part of therapy, so like a spinophobic would it be, I want to be able to visit the zoo with my children?
Yeah. So in the conversation, so if we're doing that structured exposure that we talked about, which isn't meta-levels but it's informed by a theory, we'd certainly be asking people to talk about their goals for why they wanted to face it and also why they found it difficult to face it. Because that's that opportunity to broaden your awareness so that when you can engage in control during exposure, you're doing it from an informed perspective of what difference it really might make. If you're doing Metalevel's with someone with spider-phobia, you'd be talking about their experiences and you would be saying, like, well, what makes this a problem, and what difference does this make if you could do this? And so you would be asking the kind of questions that would help them explain to you why it's a problem, which would naturally go to those goals for why they're facing therapy in the first place. But you're not monitoring it in a tight way. You're basically saying to the client, you keep on coming to these sessions until you think that you've got what you need from it, so you don't need to come anymore.
And how do you introduce it at the start?
Generally, in a very quite a modest way, in the sense of we just say these are opportunities for you to talk about your problems, and I'll be asking you questions as you go along, and then really just let it go, but we get feedback very often, like every few minutes we're saying, how's this going? Is this about right for you, or is this the pace that you want, or how's it been going talking about this? So we kind of get ongoing feedback just to check if it's not quite what they thought it was going to be. But yeah, Tim Carey at the start of Delivering Metalevel started by explaining it in some quite theoretical terms, and he just thought, I'm just wasting time here listening to my own voice when I should be helping the clients just get on with kind of talking about their difficulties and trying to sort them out. But I do get this, it's interesting. I think CBT therapists sometimes think that it sounds a bit like person-centred counselling, but actually we've got one of our MOL therapists on a person-centred counselling course, and he's finding it really difficult, partly because in Metalevel we're always pushing people to come up with more, whereas in person-centred counselling you're very set back and you're just waiting for material to come up, and whereas we're often interrupting people and just saying, what happened just there? So it's got that pushiness of a CBT, if you like, but it's got the client-centeredness of a person-centered therapy, and it's got that acknowledgement of conflict that you'd have in a psychodynamic therapy, but without any form of interpretation, even a tentative formulation. So it's kind of, we think it brings the best of each of those, but it's quite different.
What about homework, given you mentioned the best?
Yeah. There's no homework in Metalevel. People's brains tend to do spontaneous homework. Having done the therapy, they kind of say, well, after I had that session, I was thinking about all kinds of things and I was working it through, and some clients actually deliberately book, say, a walk in the park straight after an MOL session because they're still working through stuff that they've discussed. So yeah, we don't set homework, but we expect that a lot of change will happen outside the session.
And what's the setting in which you deliver it?
Well, they're very varied.
What setting? I know you mentioned prisons, for example, and inpatient areas.
I mean, I practiced it in an IAP setting for a while. Okay. We've got a handful of low intensity therapists in primary care in Salford who do Metalevel therapy. So it actually is being used across very different client groups and settings.
How would you choose the people? How would they choose you?
By giving it a go.
Or so just picking someone random, or would you sort of think, oh, this kind of problem looks like...
Well, you mean if there was one MRI therapist amongst a group and they could choose that versus others? Yeah, we have done that. Yeah, when we've done research, we've had a little description of what MOL will be like and what the low intensity CBT would be like, and then people make a choice for that. But often, because of the nature of services, the therapist, the practitioner that assesses them is then the one that provides the intervention. But some of them, so there's a few people that come back and have Metalevel having had CBT, and we provide the option if people want something different.
Do you not find it's a bit of a leap of faith, or that you kind of...
It's a massive leap of faith to if you were going to go straight into Metalevel from what you guys are doing. But what we tend to do when we've done workshops is people just bring in Metalevel questioning into their practice, and they maybe do bring it in when there's a lot of ambivalence around an aspect, or it's not quite clear what the problem is, and just try it for size. And we're not expecting people to kind of have this sort of blind.
Because I think I would find it very hard to do this, and one of the things I think would be difficult is what you have out there with the OCD thing about the different levels. I guess you could argue might be like a kind of formulation. You could think of that like
so I deliberately drew it so that it would be what if you were doing formulation according to PCT, it would look like that, but we don't explicitly share it. Yeah.
So I can accept like no formulation. Fine, that would be quite fun. So but I guess the bit that I would be worried about is like taking it on faith that people really are going to get the take-home message and it's going to go on board. Because recently, I in therapy, I've been thinking that actually I take it less and less for granted that people do get it and understand what they need to be doing, and that's why I'm getting increasingly more and more rigid and passing people around and trying to control them and get them to write things down and listen to summaries and come back and do homework, because I think it often.
Well, no, we do the opposite. It's more of a try it and see approach. So the idea is you give people this opportunity to have this sustained ability to talk and notice their experience as they're describing a problem. And some people have compared it to a sort of a mindful state, but while you're talking about a problem, not as some kind of training exercise. Give them a go at it, and I guess our rationale is if that's something that they find useful, they will do more of it. And a lot of our clients who have had many sessions say, I've started to ask myself the same questions, and I've started to allow my mind to go to places that I hadn't before.
But when you get to the point of the OCD person thinking, so my conclusion at the top level is I want to be a good person, there's still that conflict of I want to be a good person by doing rituals and also by being
Well, you might think so, but from our experience, when people are at that perspective and they've given free rein to talk about both sides, it's one of those moments that I'm sure you've seen in CBT where people really reappraise their situation and start to kind of let go of habits and experiences that they've been doing repeatedly before that. So I think we're taking people to the same place
but the bit
that
we're
other
more
therapists do.
mechanistically trying to do then is to say, like,
Yeah, you're
okay,
trying
so
to
thinking differently. What are you going to do differently as a consequence?
Yeah,
of
you're
being
trying to
different?
take the reins and kind of know that that's happening by doing that from the outside, whereas we've got the faith that their brain is doing that anyway from the inside.
And I think what would help me to take that leap of faith would be to have some way of knowing whether that was working apart from the person I just saying.
Video camera in the house, is that what you say?
Yeah, someone's
Yeah, we just use it, so regularly asking the clients, how's this going? Can you
It might be quite nicely because you've got OCD and no one's pushing you to change it. And bit of a chat and someone's asking lots of involved questions.
It's interesting, but most people that go through it say it's actually a bit unpleasant and a bit niggly and a bit kind of hard work, but they want to do it anyway.
After a while, in case you start asking why they've twitched or kind of like.
Well, that's the funny thing is you think it would be an intrusive thing, but when we do it, and obviously we haven't got time today, it's a very smooth process. We actually do this exercise where we have one client, and however many therapists are training that day are therapists, and you have one question each, and you just go around the room, and this one client is on the spot, not a patient, another therapist, talking about a real problem, and you just keep on talking, and you know that the next person in the room is going to ask you the next question.
Sounds like a party game.
Well, it's certainly an interesting experience. And what we find, and people who do this for the first time, their expectations are really challenged because they thought it would be, they'd be felt on the spot, they felt challenged, but actually it's a very natural process of just being allowed to carry on talking about what you're talking about and notice things, put things into words that you might not have mentioned if you hadn't been prompted about it. And when it works like that, then it's working well. If it works and the person perceives it to be intrusive, then you would modify it in a way that would then work for them.
How did you get into it, Brian?
Yeah, so I got into this through when I was doing my PhD. I was kind of really frustrated by the fact that CBT seems to be a combination of cognitive theory and behavioural theory, and they seemed to be two different theories that did not combine in a satisfactory way for me. I needed a way to link the higher order processes with the behavioural aspects, and so I was on the search for a theory that was going to explain that, and I came across PCT in the late 90s, and it had a picture of this hierarchy which showed really seamlessly how you got these momentary behaviours acting in the service of increasingly higher level goals. And to me that was a way that actually squared this issue, this concern that I'd had. And so I read more, I wrote a paper, to look at, to sort of describe how CBT might work from a perceptual control theory point of view. It took about 5 years to come out, 2005. When it came out, Tim Carey contacted me and said, you know that theory you've just used? Well, we've been using it to directly inform a therapy, method of levels, come up and see us. So in 2005, 2006, went to see him do it, sat in on loads of sessions. And to me, up until that point, I think I'd had maybe one, maybe two change moments in the therapy session, you know, that I could recognise with clients. Some you don't get any. And I was sitting with Tim watching him do method levels, and he was on the edge of his seat, just like listening to the person, asking these questions, and you just saw kind of what we would call in cognitive terms, reappraisals and new perspectives coming out every kind of 5 or 10 minutes of a session. I was like, this is kind of different. Something's happening quicker here. And then from that point onwards, myself and Sarah Tai just took it upon ourselves to just learn it, research it, train it, and what have you. And I do loads of other research with the theory now. I do stuff on sort of motor control and dementia and all areas where control is relevant, and you know, apply it across the board.
Where was that? Where did you go to?
Where did I go to see Tim in Fife, near St Andrews. That's where he was doing his primary care practice for a while. He's in Australia now.
You tell us about being on repeat.
It was fun, and I did do questions from a kind of PCT point of view, but not many of those got into the final cut. But it was fun.
Did you get a badge?
Yeah. I was on ITN News the other day, and it was an even shorter clip. All on the strength of this one study, because people love talking about spiders. And we did a Children in Need Day, not televised, we did a Children in Need Day where people came in who had spider and bug fears, and we just did this dynamic hierarchies with people about 10 minutes at a time, just going from one person to the next. It was a very interesting thing, because people could learn from observation as well as going through it, so that was quite good fun. So, yeah. Shall I round up now, or no, you've got... Not going till 5?
Just example.
Yeah.
I'm just interested, going back to your the client-led booking, sort of the flexible booking system. Where do you draw a line? I mean, do you ever sort of say this is the end of therapy, or could it sort of dribble on forever?
Yeah, there are all kinds of service structures that end up setting their own constraints, aren't they? But if we were going to set up a method level service for ourselves, we wouldn't put a cut-off point on it.
No limit.
Yeah.
And is there any definition of a dropout in that structure? Do you have a concept
no, there
of
wouldn't
someone
be.
Where the therapy hasn't worked for them, or is that not a concept?
Well, certainly, yeah. There'd be plenty of people that it's not worked because it's not, made the change that they want to make out of it. But
I mean, if someone doesn't book in again after sort of 3 goes with you, do you have any classification of like, oh, that didn't work out, or that's all they wanted, so that worked out? That's all they wanted.
And when, like, Rob's been doing this in early intervention in psychosis, and he's had some patients in the trial, he didn't see them for 3 months, and then suddenly they started coming, and they came for like 5 sessions. Now, in a normal service, they would have been discharged by that point. But he just left the door open, and then they just thought, oh, I'm ready now, and we just used it. And who are we to say how people balance their lives with their therapy appointments? Any other thoughts or questions? You're like, oh my goodness, it's quite different.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it is
really interesting.
I don't think the theory is that different from the heart of what we're doing in CBT. We're helping people question their everyday rules and assumptions. We're helping people engage with emotional experience. We're helping people reclaim their lives. That's what CBT therapists all know we're doing. And method of levels is just an exercise in just doing that, stripping everything else out.
But how many people can book in appointments at the same time? I'm guessing you have a waiting list. 'Cause otherwise
Well,
we're
it's
gonna be
interesting.
people just trying to book in.
Rob did his test trial in early intervention psychosis, and he started by having sort of arbitrarily only offering it to 20 patients on the waiting list, and not enough people booked in, so he just opened it up to everyone, and that was actually manageable in the time that he'd had in his drop-in service. And obviously, there's always going to be a limit, and ideally, you'd have slots open at all kinds of times for people. But it's the kind of this idea that you're going to get overrun by people booking in. It's never happened yet. And Louise would always deliberately overbook sessions so that, like they do in flights, knowing that some people won't come along. So you, again, make it more efficient.
Is there a supervision model for it? Does a supervisor use them?
Yeah. So we have supervision every week.
I want to go.
Peer supervision. Sorry?
I want to go.
Well, it's in Manchester. We either work through clinical cases or we do practice largely, or sometimes we talk about points of the theory. So quite often we'll use method levels questioning with a therapist about the problem that they're having with the client, and we'll just use the method levels questioning to help them solve it, essentially, or work through it.
Is there an assessment process?
Yeah, well, we've got 2 adherence measures. We've not formalised a kind of cut-off point on those for kind of competence, but one of them is based around the CTSR, so you could use the existing sort of assumed competence level. And then we've got another one that's sort of tailor-made, which is called the MOL self-evaluation scale and other therapist evaluation scale. And it's just checking that the therapists are keeping them with those goals, essentially.
Would this type of therapy assume that the patient doesn't need a diagnosis?
Yeah.
It's just whatever they consider their problem.
Yeah. So you cut out that time as well. It's new. It's when I was in Denmark, I called this talk from CBT critique to cloud cuckoo land, because it's just it seems so different, and people might think we're in cloud cuckoo land thinking this, but it just seems to make scientific sense to us, our reading of it. So we're not going to be disillusioned by the system that might not fit this, because this is what the science is telling us, so this is what we're saying should happen. But whether it happens is down to people, isn't it? Should we round up?
Thank you.
All right, no worries.